Good morning, colleagues, and thank you for the opportunity to share a few points about carbon markets. Let me start by thanking the two colleagues for very elaborate presentations on Article 6, as well as on the outcomes of the African Union conference on carbon markets that we just had. Just a few points from our perspective as UNDP. There is a lot of demand, external demand on our governments to go into agreements on carbon markets. Yet clearly, our countries are not ready because the institutional arrangements, the infrastructure, and the capacities that can enable us to participate fairly and effectively in carbon markets are still being developed. The sad thing is that even when these institutional arrangements and the frameworks that should guide how we engage in carbon markets are being developed, agreements are being signed by our governments. And I think we need to find a way to reach the highest levels of government, because this is where these agreements are signed. And then when it comes down now to implementation, we find that there are gaps, and there are also a lot of risks that have been included in the MOUs signed. From UNDP's perspective, we've been engaging governments to help them to develop the various institutional frameworks, regulatory frameworks, and carbon market strategies that should be guiding how we engage effectively in the markets. So as UNDP, we do have a carbon market offer where we actually engage governments and provide the technical capacities needed for them to develop the frameworks that will ensure that participation is effective and it leads to sustainable development. Let me also now go to the point about our perspectives about carbon markets. When you talk to our governments, you realize that talking about carbon markets is usually around finance. And our governments see carbon markets as a way of mobilizing resources. But you recall from the two presentations that the issue of finance was not mentioned. And that is because carbon markets, especially under Article 6, were designed to help countries to increase their ambition in terms of emission reductions. So that is the primary objective. However, there are opportunities for raising finance as a core benefit of engagement in the carbon markets. And I think this is the narrative that we need to continue to speak to our governments, because when you talk to our governments, they talk about opportunities in carbon markets without linking carbon markets, especially under Article 6, to their NDCs. So I think it's important that we bring that linkage and the awareness that carbon markets are good for finance, but it's not the primary objective. And also, what we discover is that when you talk about carbon markets, our governments are thinking about nature-based carbon credits, basically looking at forests. But the question is, which forests are we talking about? On whose land are these forests? I think it's important to realize that it's not only about forests, it's also about technology-based credits. And I think this is where we really need to identify the potentials for us to develop projects, carbon credit generating projects. We also need to realize that we have to be very strategic when we link our NDCs to the carbon markets. In our NDCs, we have conditional and unconditional targets. Unconditional targets are usually low-hanging fruits, which as countries we can use to meet our emission targets. We must ensure that when you're talking about carbon markets, we focus on the conditional targets, where we can then invite investments on carbon-generating projects. And that's also the important need to link the carbon markets and our NDCs. It's also important for Africa to have a common standard so that we avoid the issue of the rush to the bottom. Because if we have different approaches, different methodologies from one country to the other, including on how we determine the carbon price, we may have a situation where other countries have their carbon credits at $1, where others have a carbon credits at $50 or $100. So it is very important that we have a common approach to this. Maybe let me conclude with key messages. We must ensure that as we talk about carbon markets, we remember that our priority is adaptation. And we must look at opportunities where adaptation projects can actually also generate mitigation outcomes. And then we should be able to use those to generate our credits, because adaptation is important. But if we take the Article 6 as it is just focusing on emission reductions, and we may just be a vehicle for those who have caused more emissions to achieve their emission targets. So it's important to focus on adaptation. Number two, communities we should make sure that whatever carbon market engagement we have does not disadvantage communities or any members of our societies, especially around land. No community should lose even a hectare of land due to engagement in carbon markets. We must make sure that the carbon price is the correct one. And this requires us to have common methodologies for determining the prices. We must ensure that whatever we do with carbon markets, environmental integrity is ensured, because that's the only way we can ensure that our engagement in carbon markets actually contributes to achieving sustainable development. Capacity building, I think we've seen from the two presentations that to operationalize the carbon markets requires a lot of technical capacities. We've also seen that in the presentation, we recognize the youth dividend. There is an opportunity for us to engage the youth to build their capacities for these different requirements to engage in carbon markets. The last time I checked, we didn't have a single African who is certified as an auditor for carbon markets. And that is really a very bad starting point. But this is where now we see the opportunity for us to really build capacities. We have to take deliberate effort to bring our youth into the space and provide the necessary capacity building for us to have the requisite capacities to engage fully in the carbon markets, and so that we do not go the same way we did with the CDM. Finally, I want to say we need to encourage our private sector, local private sector, to engage in the carbon markets. Let's not, again, wait for the foreign investment to drive carbon credit projects. So we need to build the capacities of our local private sector to be the drivers of the carbon markets in terms of generating credits. Those are the few points I thought I would emphasize from the two presentations that were made. And also to say that as UNDP, we are also working with the other UN agencies through our coalitions to support countries that need the technical capacities to develop the requisite institutional arrangements to ensure that countries have the national carbon market frameworks and carbon strategies that will guide how we engage in carbon markets. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency, for highlighting the need for the right architecture for carbon markets on our continent and the challenges that exist in engaging in this market. I would like to call on Mr. Katerere to come and give his perspective as a long-term expert on carbon markets, at the same time from the perspective of the civil society on biodiversity. And before you come, I'd like to recognize the Honorable Minister of the Federal Republic of Democratic Republic of